Well, for people that don't know me, my name's Justin Watkins. A lot of people in society know me. I've been doing work for the Historical Society for the last 2 decades, so going back to 2004. I was born in El Paso, Texas, but moved here when I was a year and a half, so I've lived in this area most of my life. Really got interested in history when I was 9 years old, and discovered a genealogy document in China drawer, at a home, and asked my mom, "Who are these names? There's a list, and who are these names?" And I don't know how loud I need to talk for the camera, but anyway, hopefully I'm talking loud enough. If you need me to talk louder, please let me know.
I think you're okay.
Okay, so I was 9 years old and was really fascinated by that, and then I was around that same time I also discovered there was a lot of genealogy in the Bible. So then I got into that and got into documenting the Bible names and figuring out how they fit into the Bible stories and that sort of thing. I was very much a genealogy nerd as a kid, among other things. I was competing in the geography bee, spelling bee, that sort of thing. I was homeschooled, so that kind of helped with that. Wound up going to the state geography bee 4 years in a row, finished as high as second, so got to really have some really fun experiences as a kid through the homeschooling environment that I might not have gotten had I been in like public school or private school, although I did do a little bit of public school and private school as well. I went to church with Dennis Hahn, and Dennis Hahn was kind of the one that introduced me to local history. So I don't know if you know who Dennis Hahn is, I don't know if you ever met him, but he's the one that whenever there's an anniversary, he'll write an article in the Heritage, for example, talking about the history of the society. He's actually a past president of the Historical Society, and he's been involved with the Sons of the American Revolution chapter here. He's also the corporate president, I guess you could call it, for First Baptist Church of St. Charles, and that's the church I grew up in. And so this church has been around since 1888, so a lot of history there as well as far as the history of that church goes. So that's kind of how I started. So when I was 9, got my first family genealogy. When I was still 9, I was almost 10. My uncle gave that to me, and so I've done a genealogy and history from that, and just from the experience of my ancestors, because I found out I had family that lived here, came here in 1810, 1819, 1807, some cases later, but on my mom's side, I found out that there were ties to several pioneering families, including by marriage a connection to Nathan Boone, who was the son of Daniel Boone. So that's kind of how things started. That's the short answer. I could give you a longer answer, but we'll go with that just for the sake of time.
Yeah, I think we can just go with the short version.
Sure.
I'm sure we'll come back to it.
That's fine.
In our little chit chat before the interview, you talked about your academic background, and how your degrees in history allowed, and interest in genealogy allowed you to get into work within cemeteries, like the history.
Sure. So my first cemetery visits, probably, and I don't really remember this, but there's pictures of this at home. Probably when I was 4 years old. I know that there were some family members did a lot of cemetery visits then. In adulthood, the first cemetery that I remember visiting, we would visit the cemeteries where my mom's relatives were buried, so out in Pettis County, Missouri, north of Sedalia, Missouri, between Sedalia and Interstate 70. And again, I don't know how many people in St. Charles County are familiar with the geography of Pettis County, but Pettis County is pretty much due west of St. Charles County. You could actually draw a line on the map straight across from here to Sedalia. As far as St. Charles County cemeteries go, the first cemetery that I visited was the Peter Earhart family burying ground. The Peter Earhart family burying ground is actually, the people buried there are related to our current archivist, Amy Hake. And it's a cemetery, it's a burying ground located on the hill, up on a hill overlooking Spencer Creek. It's in my subdivision, incidentally. on property owned by the city of St. Peter since 1999. And the city of St. Peter's, right after the flood of 1993, put in a walking trail along Spencer Creek. And I took several walks, but I remember my freshman year of college taking a walk on the trail, and for some reason, this particular walk, I happened to notice there was a fence. Did they have fence? Yeah, I think I noticed. I noticed there was a marker up on the hill, like a tombstone looking thing. I was like, what is that? Why haven't I seen this before? And it's one of those. Why hadn't I noticed that before? So I went up and investigated, and there was, on the ground, I think part of it was because it was lying in pieces on the ground, so you couldn't always see it because of the vegetation growth. But this particular winter day, you could. And it said in memory of Earhart, Hunt, and Klein family. I was very curious about that, and there was a friend of mine who was big into genealogy there. She was from Kansas City, and so she was in town visiting early 1999. This was in January 1999. She and another friend of mine who is from St. Charles, and the three of us, we went and looked at it, and I said, hey, look at this. This is kind of cool, isn't it? So, I just thought it was really cool because here's a cemetery that's been in my backyard practically. I mean, you could see the site actually from my court. So that's kind of gotten into cemeteries. Now the degree information, since I did mention that prior to that. So I was going to Missouri Baptist College at the time, became Missouri Baptist University in 2002. Graduated from Missouri Baptist with a double major actually, so a Bachelor of Arts degree with dual emphasis in history and in music performance with an emphasis in piano. And I've been able to use both of those for sources of income, since then. I think I've told you some about that. I wound up working as a student fellow at MOAB my last year there. And then 2006, 2003 to 2006, I went and pursued a graduate degree, master's degree in history at UMSL. Something I didn't tell you, since you did interview Victoria Cosner, I wound up working as a graduate research assistant at the Scott Joplin House State Historic Site, 2005, 2006. Well, the person that was head of that historic site at the time was a lady named, and at the time her name was Victoria Love. So that's when I first met her, was as a graduate research assistant. I was doing research on the neighborhood and the music history in the area surrounding the Scott Joplin House, which is great because he had roots and ties to Sedalia. I had ties to Sedalia. I like music. I like history. I have degrees in music and history. Here's a guy, and here I'm looking at, the history of music in the St. Louis area, specifically the history of ragtime in St. Louis. Really fascinating topic, and did all this research on that. So after that, I got the master's degree, and then wound up, by that time I was doing some volunteer work here. I'd done some volunteer work here in 2004 under Bill Popp. Bill Popp was the archivist at the time. And in 2007, I started, they were looking for the person that had been heading up the archives on Saturdays. Maybe Bill himself had been doing it. Anyway, he was looking to divest himself of that responsibility and only be here on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So they were looking for a Saturday person. And I got asked to do that. And there was a little bit of pay involved. So I did that for off and on for 4 years, 2007 to 2011. And that's what really got my feet wet into the archives here and really understanding what was here. And, just doing the research in that plus doing research on Main Street in St. Charles. In 2010, I started visiting cemeteries in St. Charles County. In 2009, I was doing Pettis County. In 2010, I started doing St. Charles County. First going out to the Roth Burying Ground in Pleasant Spring, and then from there, in 2011, I just started going to all kinds of places throughout the county. You see a lot of variety of different geographical and topographical features as you go through the county. You go out to Portage de Sioux or to West Alton, and it's flat. It's just flat. It's just floodplain, and it's Black Walnut's the same way. You go to a place like, I think it's locally called Femme Osage, but it looks like it's Femme Osage, which is French. Femme is the French word for woman, actually. And you go out to a place like that, or to New Melly, to Wentzville even, but to New Melly, especially in Augusta, and you start getting into these huge hills and valleys. And I remember going to the cemetery where Femme Osage United Church of Christ Cemetery, and you go up this hill, and it's a steep hill. And the time I was driving a 1996 Corolla, I'm like, how is this thing going to make this up this hill? Because this was not like the hills here in St. Charles. This was steep. It made it up there. I to this day, I don't know. I mean, I remember I pressed the pedal all the way down to the floor going up there. And so those were some of my cemetery adventures going around the county. But really had a lot of fun time doing that in 2011, 2012, 2013 even. Did some visits, and then since then, off and on, I've done some more. So I went to back to All Saints again in 2014. Gillette Family Burying Ground isn't too far from me, so I visited that a couple times. And each one of these cemeteries has their own story. Has their own story of what has this property gone through. Has their own stories of each person buried in the cemetery. There's a story there. And what can really make it interesting, and can form the foundation for a cemetery tour, is what are the stories of the people that are buried here? What was it like to, you go to Grant Chapel and you see these markers for U.S. colored troops. What was it like for, to be in the U.S. colored troops? What was it like for an African American serving from Wentzville in the Civil War in the Union? You go to Oak Grove and there's so many prominent names buried there. Arnold Krekel, who had his own unit. Even today, historians talk about Krekel's Dutch and the role that they had locally in St. Charles County during the Civil War. Theodore C. Salvator has the tallest monument. Well, where did he get the money from that? And then you dig into his story and find out, well, he started from nothing, but then he worked his way up and eventually became, superintendent of several railroad car manufacturing companies throughout the Midwest, in Indiana and Illinois and in Missouri. And, in him surviving the bushwhackers during the Civil War and being captured by the Union, when he was fighting the Confederacy at Arkansas Post. And there's just some great stories in these cemeteries, some of which have now been told thanks to the Oak Grove Cemetery tour, which I know you have in your notes here. But you go to there are other great cemeteries a person can go to and get stories, a wide variety of stories from. You go to the Memorial Gardens, and you have Dave Ricketts, for example. A guy who played for the Cardinals. He's buried at St. Charles Memorial Gardens. You go to All Saints Catholic Church. That there Ken Heinzelman is buried. Ken Heinzelman was a Major League Baseball pitcher in the 1940s and 1950s for the Browns, the Orioles, for a couple other clubs, maybe Phillies. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But anyway, he's buried at All Saints. But then you have other people that are these pioneer settlers, and you read their stories. Stories about Blanchette, about Jean-Baptiste Montesab, who's listed in the Borromeo Church records as being buried here. Blanchette, the founder of St. Charles, and there's so much to the story that when you read something that's like, well, that's a highly fictionalized account or something like that with Blanchette. You have to separate fact from fiction. But it's just every person there has a story of some kind that should be told. When you're putting together a cemetery tour like the last three, because Oak Grove Cemetery Tour has been put together in 2017, held in 2017, 2022, and now in 2024. you've got to find those people that are most interesting. You think this is going to be very interesting for people to read. People are going to want to know about this person. They're going to find this person's story to be impactful, or to be interesting, or to be something new and different that they might not know about, or a person that they may not have heard of. But then you read about what their contribution was to the community. You're like, wow, that's really cool. You know. So that's kind of the neat thing about cemetery tours. And that's really where, in a way, you're kind of, like when I do historical research, especially when I started doing historical research, I would focus on names and dates. My mom would be like, okay, you need to put flesh on the bones. She would talk about putting flesh on the bones. Because my mom was a published author, published in children's magazines. And I think my dad published some articles too. And my mom and my older brother had co-published an article on Roaring River State Park in southwest Missouri, in Missouri Life in 1984. And so it's not like, she was giving me advice it's not like she didn't know what she was talking about. She knew exactly what she was talking about. She'd been published in Humpty Dumpty, Internal Magazine, and a couple other, publications, and put together a Bible study on Daniel, Elijah, and Elisha for David C. Cook, for Accent Publishing Company in 1993. So that's kind of what a cemetery tour is like. You're putting flesh on the bones, so to speak. You're taking a name, the name and those dates, and you're telling the story. Not every tombstone has a dash on it, but let's say what happened in between that birth date and that death date. You're kind of telling the story of what was their life like in between the time when they were born and the time when they died.
Can you talk a little bit about what kind of records or what you look for whenever you visit these cemeteries?
Well, it kind of depends. One of the things I want to know about is the history of the cemetery itself. So when was the property purchased? When was it a cemetery? So take for example, and sometimes cemeteries move. There's a lot of that occurred, for example, in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. There's a lot of that occurred there. There's some of that that's occurred here in St. Charles County as well. For example, St. Charles Borromeo Cemetery has been in 3 different locations. Wayne and Jackson. Then where the church is located today, that was originally where the cemetery was, the second location of the cemetery. And then the third location, moving out to Randolph Street, I think in 1856. So they moved around 1831, I think it was, to 4th, 5th, Decatur, and basically 5th and Decatur Street, where the church is now. And then in 1856, they bought the land out on Randolph Street, and then moved the cemetery there. So understanding the history of the cemetery, to me, is important, because that gives me an idea if I'm going to tell the story of the cemetery. One of the things we do in the Oak Grove Cemetery Tour each time is tell the story of the cemetery first. What is the history of the cemetery? With Oak Grove, the city cemetery of St. Charles, that story starts in 1831 with the city council approving a burying ground, city burying ground. Now that was at 4th, 5th, Pike, and Tompkins Streets. Today, that's a shopping center. I think there's a Dollar General there. There was a dance studio in there, I think, recently. Medicine shop has been in there. Seems like there was a stamp store, but it's a strip mall now. Well, how do we go from a cemetery to a strip mall? Well, you do the research, and which I did do the research. I find it's what's a city park in the 1875 atlas. So it's the city park, and then in 1905, so the city purchased the property. They own the property, but of course they could, because that part was part of the St. Charles Commons, and so instead of leasing it out, they just held on to the title. So from 1831 to 1905, it's owned by the city. In 1905, there was a drive to bring a branch of the Roberts Johnson Ranch Shoe Company to St. Charles. So then that property was sold. There was a group of businessmen that got together, formed a group to bring them in. They brought them in, and then it became a shoe factory. And then as they were digging up, there were skeletons discovered, and even caskets, and the newspaper reported the whole thing. Well, you go to Oak Grove today, there's an old city cemetery section, which is kind of toward the back of the cemetery. And the nice thing is, so the current cemetery sexton in Oak Grove is Chuck Ambrose. Mark Hollenberg was the previous cemetery sexton, and when we did our first cemetery tour, he was the cemetery sexton, and he was able to provide a lot of information to the cemetery committee, which was formed, I think, in large part because of the cemetery research I was doing. Because I'd done the cemetery, done the visits in 2011, 2012, 2013, but I was also going through the burial records here, cemetery records here to some degree, which, you know, I'm now trying to go back and finish up. I thought I completed them, but I go back, it's like, oh, I don't think I got all of them entered in. And, which is not surprising, because there's, I think I counted 235 cemeteries on the website, something like that. That's a lot of different places to, you know, burial grounds, cemeteries, church burial grounds, that sort of thing. Church graveyards, I guess they originally called. Now you said you were from O'Fallon, so you're probably familiar with Assumption Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
Well, finding the deed record for them was easy. Found they were established in 1871. Just go to the Recorder of Deeds office. A lot of the deed records of the Recorder of Deeds office, they have them going back to 1804. So being able to pull the deed record and that sort of thing, but also the plat. There's a plat for O'Fallon at the Recorder of Deeds office. And when I was researching the history of the Krekel House, you know where the Krekel House is?
I do not.
Is it a bridal shop now?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I was really mad whenever they made it into a bridal shop.
So it's a bridal shop.
Yes.
Okay. All right. A lot of local history people were upset with that. So researching the history, I was researching the chain of that because there was a former archivist here that was interested in the history of it. It's like, okay, well, I'll do some work on it. And there was a mention of a plaque. I mentioned Arnold Krekel. He's buried at Oak Grove, but he also happened to own the land that O'Fallon was built on, the original part of O'Fallon, and he platted it out. There's a plat that he made, and he sold lots. And one of the lots that he sold to the Catholic Church. And the Assumption was founded in 1871. Property was bought in 1871, and that's the beginning of the church and cemetery there. So that's how you get Assumption Catholic Church in O'Fallon. Now, Arnold Krekel was not Catholic, but his brother was. And he thought enough of his brother that he said, you know, my brother needs to have a Catholic church located nearby, near where he lives, and here you go. That's speculation on my part. I don't know if that's what happened, but I do know this. I know Nicholas Krekel gets his property. There's two deeds for it, 1856 and 1857. There's two different deed records for it. I do know in 1871 that Arnold Krekel does deed the church property to the Catholics in 1871. And that is a matter of record. So sometimes history can be a matter of record. Sometimes you're like, well, it could be, you know, when you look at motives and that sort of thing, that's where it can become kind of speculative. And you have to be careful. Say, okay, it's possible this is what happened, but I can't prove this, but I can prove this.
Mm-hmm. It's almost a historian's job to come up with the reasoning behind something.
Oh yeah.
With records and to back them up.
And sometimes it's obvious, you know, but sometimes it's not. And sometimes like, okay, well, you kind of connected us, which like you heard me doing there. It's like, well, it's possible that this, and this. You know, I can't prove this, but it makes sense if this and this, and you know, and that sort of thing. Looking at well, Nicholas was Catholic. Nicholas is buried at Assumption, I believe, if I remember correctly. Although one of his infant children is actually buried at All Saints. The gravestone's at All Saints.
Also Catholic, though.
Also Catholic, yes. But All Saints is much earlier. All Saints dates back to, well, actually their property was purchased in 1815. The original church and cemetery property was purchased in 1815. Yeah, so I know the church dates itself back to 1823. But the earliest deed record for them is 1815. And in French. So you've translated from the French.
Yep.
Which I took a year of French, so I can kind of figure out what's being said. I know enough to figure it out.
At least try to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll let you go on to your next question.
Well, I feel like I don't have a question that ties directly into what we were just talking about.
Sure.
But I think it is important to bring up, kind of like you already did, a cemetery as a source itself, or at least like the speculations you can come up with, just because of like the information you can find out. Because cemeteries can be a very scary place to some people, at least death. There's a lot of stigma behind it.
That's true.
But, you know, if you're interested in history, or if you're a historian yourself, there's so much that you can learn from a cemetery itself, or the records it holds.
Oh yeah.
That you should not overlook, because cemeteries are often a historical tool that is not necessarily used.
They're the final resting place. It's the final resting place of a person. And the idea of cemetery, the very word itself, comes from that notion of this is the resting place. It comes from a word very similar to, it comes with that idea of almost, that was the original connotation, was the idea that this is a resting place. And I know a lot of people, you see these videos out there of, we're going to do this paranormal investigation in this cemetery, Francis Howell Cemetery. I remember there's a video online, I don't know if it's still online, where they're doing this paranormal investigation at night at Francis Howell Cemetery over in Bush Wildlife. And it's ironic where I see stuff like that, because whenever I go to cemetery, more often than not, they're some of the most peaceful places I've ever been in. And there's something about a cemetery, it's almost like you're getting away with nature. And by getting away with, I mean you're getting away from, let me see if I can phrase it a little bit better, you're getting away from the hustle and bustle, and just kind of getting away from all that, and just kind of spending time with nature. Enjoying the creation around you that God has made, and enjoying that, and just saying, wow, look at that sun, look at that, that sunset or something like that, or look at that cloud cover, and look at the beautiful sky, and look at that, you got trees, you got grass, I mean, there's, especially if things have been well enough watered, you can really, it's been really nice, and you really get some good pictures. But yeah, I've not really had that. Very seldom have I ever gone to a cemetery and felt scared. It's happened on a couple of occasions. There was one time I was going to this cemetery. I was going to visit a cemetery where my great grandparents was buried down in southwest Missouri, and it was a place where a couple Civil War battles, and you could kind of feel the tension going in there. It was just you could feel the tension. There was a tension in the air, which nobody was around, but there's this tension. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Here you're going to a place where there was a Civil War battle, and then going to the cemetery, and this is a cemetery where a lot of the people that died in that battle, it's the Battle of Antonia, Missouri. A lot of people from that battle were buried in that cemetery. Now, I went to that cemetery recently again, and earlier this year when I was down there. And unfortunately, somebody has vandalized the tombstone, so the grave. But I kind of figured out where the grave was, because there is a plot of the cemetery. But people are still buried in that cemetery. I was surprised by that, because I mean it's an old cemetery going back to the 1860s. But it was just really even going down the road to the cemetery, you feel the tension. And when I got to the cemetery, it's like it was gone. And it's very interesting. Those feels. But I go to cemeteries around here. It's like, man, this is so peaceful and quiet and serene. Why do people have such attached a stigma to places like this that are some of the most beautiful places on earth, some of the most quiet places on earth? Even Oak Grove, with all the traffic that goes up and down West Clay, you get back far enough in there, you're kind of far enough away from the sound of the traffic that you kind of enjoy it. But you get in some of these rural cemeteries, it's just like, wow, look at the terrain around here. This is really cool. You can get up on a hill, I can see for a country miles, the phrase. You can see forever. And it's just really a cool experience, just seeing the geography And there's a wide variety of geography to be seen in this county. Well, I think I read that it was, I don't know, I haven't actually tested this, but I read that it was 55 miles from the point, from the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers to Fort Stell, and it was 25 miles at its widest point, north to south. I've read that. Like I said, I've not tested that out, just some of the things I've read in books about the dimensions of the county. But it's one of the largest counties in the state.
Mm-hmm. And it holds so much history as
Yes.
as it grows, as it shifts.
Yeah. Well, and consider, I mean, so St. Louis, founded in 1764, is the traditional date for St. Louis. I know there's some people that contest that. But St. Charles, I mean, Auguste Chouteau testified before the Court of Land Titles that St. Charles was founded in 1769 as a petite coat. And to think that people have been here at least that long, if not longer, because there obviously there's been, Native American sites found all throughout this county that date probably to the, I think some date from the 1200s, 1300s, some, maybe back even to the time of Christ or even before that. There's just a ton of history here. So.
Okay, but we do have to wrap up.
Yes.
Soon. So is there anything specifically you want to talk about, or you think you got your points covered?
Well, I think, hopefully I answered the questions that you wanted, and, what I was telling you about historical research in general, I think, applies to this too, is that, your knowledge, historical researcher is only as good as their, as how well they know their sources. So you have to know where to look for stuff. You have to be able to identify stuff, and people are constantly finding new things. I learned that lesson again recently, a couple years ago. There was an article I wrote on Louis Blanchette, and then there was another article on Blanchette that appeared later by one of the guys that works at the St. Charles County Heritage Museum. And he mentioned the St. Genevieve papers. Well, I hadn't heard of the St. Genevieve papers. I didn't know they existed. It's like, well, I gotta check that out, So I've been looking for St. Genevieve records. I figured, well, Family Search, they got everything digitized. Well, as it turned out they didn't. And there's this collection of colonial papers from St. Genevieve that were floating around there. So I ordered them, went down to Elmsville and looked at them. It's like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And there was a finding aid and everything. Somebody had done an index of the records. So Blanchette's mentioned in there. So is Fernando de Leyva. He's mentioned in there a lot of times. But they're records that pertain not just to St. Genevieve, but the nice thing about that is it shows all the connection with St. Genevieve and St. Charles. So, it's important to know where to look for resources. There's lots of stuff around all over the place. Newspapers from St. Charles that have wound up in different collections throughout the United States. From the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. There's a lot of stuff here that can be, it's landed here, that the county has brought to this building to be housed at the Historical Society as well. Tax records from as early as 1839, county tax records. And of course, the city tax books are here from 1856 on, for the most part. I think there's a couple years that aren't covered, but pretty much every year from that point on is covered in these tax books up until the 1960s. And so knowing what your sources are is very important as a researcher. Knowing, what is your topic, identifying your sources. Hopefully, if you find articles that have already been written on whatever topic you're researching, hopefully they've been well footnoted. And not just, there's some books here that, some things here that are, the person used footnotes. Other things here, the person didn't use footnotes. And, I'm big on footnotes and documenting sources because I want to make sure that if somebody else comes along and researches the same topics, say 20 years from now, I want to make it to where they can do the same research that I did, or they can look at the same stuff I did, and at least, even if they draw different conclusions from those sources, because they're looking at it from their vantage point, at least they're looking at the same sources. So, and maybe they can even find additional sources that I didn't think of at the time. But each that's how you build. You build piece upon piece. Each piece of the historical puzzle just keeps adding more to the story. And there's a lot of stories here to be told in St. Charles. And obviously being around since 1769, I've written on Blanchette, but I mean, there's stuff about Charles Théon that could be written. There's stuff about other prominent people that came through here. There's been articles on Lewis and Clark that have been written, and Lewis actually he actually purchased property near Portage de Sioux, and there's an article in the Heritage about it. And so there's stuff like that you just do the research, and then a lot of times my MO is I do the research, and then I develop the story as I go, and then organize it in a way that will be interesting to the reader. And hopefully I can put in that hook at the beginning that makes the person interested in the topic, and hopefully there's enough interesting information and not too much detail to where the person's eyes glaze over before you get to the conclusion.
Yep, it's always a dream.
Yes.
The importance of historiography, but
Yes,
on
for sure.
that note, I think we're
Hopefully that
got
covers what
everything
you
done.
wanted. I know you had some questions about Oak Grove, but at least that gives you kind of a broader overview, and hopefully I answered even some of the questions that were on your sheet.
You definitely did. We did go full circle.
Yeah.
All right.